Theme for our gospel story today is the temple in Jerusalem. This was a really important place to the Jewish people, a religious site that was considered to be the most holy place in the city. The temple was a magnificent feat of architecture, standing several stories high and built with the finest materials. This was the place where the stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments had been kept before they were lost, and the place where God was thought to live on earth. By tradition, people who wanted to ask God for forgiveness or to give thanks at the temple did so, making sacrifices with animals, oil, wine, salt. They bought their sacrificial items from official sellers at the temple, people who had special permission to work there. If you wanted to pay the temple tax, a tax which was charged to help maintain the temple building, you could do so with special temple money. So anyone travelling from outside the country had to exchange money using the temple's money changers. So remember, Jesus was in Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish Passover festival. This is a really joyous festival for Jewish people, a time when they remember how God passed over the Israelite homes in Egypt, ensuring that they avoided the last of the 10 plagues. They were led from the slavery that they knew in Egypt to freedom. The temple was meant to be a special place where people could come and feel close to God. When Jesus walked into the temple on this day, he didn't like what he saw. Animals were being sold at expensive prices, and high exchange rates were being charged for people wanting to change money. Priests seemingly more important than other people. Rich people more important than poor people. Men more important than women. People who are sick not thought holy enough to get close to God. Take a moment and try to imagine how you would feel to arrive into church on Sunday, to the sight of doves flapping their wings above you, to the smell of sheep and cattle in the nave, the sound of chatter from people conducting their business all around you, tables with merchandise blocking your seat. The things that Jesus saw in the temple that day were completely legal and were permitted by the temple leaders. There were practices that abused power and made a profit out of people's desire for forgiveness. People thought they were doing things that pleased God, but really the temple wasn't being used for its proper purpose. The temple was supposed to be a place where those living in poverty could experience God's passion for justice. Instead, the people who needed God's love and generosity the most were kept at a distance. The poor people who came to the temple seeking God were going home poorer, leaving with even less than they came with. These were not practices that honoured God and brought dignity to his people. This all made Jesus really angry, and on this day he had had enough. He was ready for action. In his anger, Jesus marched through the temple, wrecking stalls, driving out those who were buying and selling things, saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." A few years ago, there was a best-selling book called Eats, Shoots and Leaves. Depending on your use of punctuation, these words bring a vision either of a panda eating a meal, shooting a gun, and legging it from a crime scene. Possibly more accurately, a panda eating bamboo shoots and green leaves. This might be a silly example, but it shows us that people don't always understand what we mean to say. And sometimes it's only when we think back over our words that we understand how misunderstandings have happened. When Jesus talked to his disciples, he quite often said things that were really difficult to understand. This day in the temple was no exception. The things Jesus was saying were really confusing. Here he was talking about destroying and rebuilding the temple in 3 days. How could this be? The temple had taken nearly 50 years to build. Well, surely it couldn't be destroyed and built again in 3 days. It was just the same when Jesus told them he was going to die. It just didn't make sense. Of course, sitting here 2,000 years later, we know the Easter story. We know that Jesus died and that he rose again. We can make connections between Jesus' stories and understand that Jesus wasn't talking about the temple building in Jerusalem at all. He was talking about his own body. Just like we like to meet in church and worship together, the early Christians loved meeting together in the temple to pray. They quickly realized that they didn't need a special place where they could be close to God, because Jesus was now the place where they could make that connection. Even knowing the full story today, this can still be hard for us to understand. But being a Christian and following Jesus is like being on a journey where we keep learning and getting to know God better. Over time, we let God's influence guide us to live better lives. Because of Jesus, because of his life, because of his death, because of the things he said and the things he did, we know that God is always present in our lives and he is here for every single one of us. Amen.